I want to move on to the topic of genetically modified foods. And this isn't going to cover the health related to that. This isn't going to cover the science behind that. This is strictly going to cover the corporatism that exists in this industry between the United States government and various agencies within the U.S. government. And yeah, some of it's going to venture off into pesticides, which are of course linked to genetically modified foods, because a lot of these genetically modified foods are created to be resistant to glyphosate and to other pesticides so that they can survive. And it allows farmers to use as much pesticide as they want. And of course, Monsanto also, one of the companies, has a hand in pesticides as well. So they create these crops that are ready to take on the pesticide and can handle it, won't die from it. And there's some interesting new science coming out related to that. So we're going to get into that. But first, we're going to talk about labeling. The U.S. Senate has held a hearing recently on GMO labeling, but apparently they were only interested in hearing one side of the argument. Several speakers at a recent Senate hearing on labeling foods that contain genetically modified organisms are connected to or have shown support for the big agriculture industry. The hearing, titled Agriculture Biotechnology, a look at federal regulation and stakeholder perspectives, comes in response to a bill passed by the U.S. House of Reps in July. This bill would create a federal voluntary standard for GMO labeling and block mandatory labeling efforts by states. Now, you guys may remember this. It's called the Safe and Accurate Food Labeling Act, some more Orwellian speak. But it's also known as the DARK Act, or Deny Americans the Right to Know Act, by its critics. And this law would effectively nullify GMO labeling measures like the bill recently passed in Vermont. The Vermont law is scheduled to go into effect in July 2016. Maine and Connecticut, they've also passed laws which require labeling, but those measures do not go into effect until their bordering states also pass legislation. But all of those bills could be off the table, and states basically won't have the right to come up with their own labeling system. And the way they're selling this is basically, okay, so all the corporate entities are coming out and saying, we don't want a patchwork of state laws and local bills on GMOs and labeling, so we should pass a law that says that they can't do that, and instead we're going to create a federal standard created by us and our corporate partners, and everybody will have to abide by that federal standard and then go through our loopholes and our regulations to be a part of that. And if they don't do that, if they do anything else, it will be illegal. But you know what? Let me just sidebar here real quick. If this does happen, which I'm sorry to say, guys, usually all the bad things happen. We can pretty much say that the TPP is going to go through. There's this CISA surveillance bill. That's more than likely going to go through. Things like the NDAA, when indefinite detention, that went through. I mean, these things get through. It's just too late in the game to think that anybody's going to stop these bills. We just have to accept it and find ways to counteract it, to counter-propagandize people with information about awareness and solutions. So, back to this. The U.S. Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry heard testimonies from several speakers representing farmers, the GMO lobby, and consumer groups. Officials from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the USDA, and the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, and the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, also testified. So all of these government officials related to food, drugs, Department of Agriculture, and the environment, and speakers representing all these different organizations. The hearing was a balanced look at the issues surrounding GMOs and biotechnology in general. At least, that's what the Senate wants you to believe. As Reuters reported, the Consumers Union and 5 other consumer organizations sent a letter to the Senate committee complaining that the lineup of speakers was not balanced and did not include a consumer representative. Jean Holloran, Director of Food Policy Initiatives for Consumers Union, said, time and time again, a large majority of consumers have expressed strong support for GMO labeling. Ronnie Cummins, International Director for the Organic Consumers Association and a speaker at the hearing, released a scathing review of the events. Today's hearing on H.R. 1599 made a total mockery of democracy. Of the 8 witnesses allowed to testify, only 1 could be remotely considered as someone who represents the interests of consumers and public health. The other 7 have ties to the biotech and corporate food industries and were there to represent the interests of corporations, not people. So a list of these industry witnesses include representatives from the American Soybean Association, Natural National Corn Growers Association, and Food and Agriculture for the Biotechnology Industry Organization. All organizations that directly benefit from GMO technology, as of course soybeans and corn are the most heavily genetically modified products in the United States. So yeah, they have a stake being there one way or the other, but it's interesting the comments that were made. Perhaps unsurprisingly, a majority of the witnesses came out in support of giving the federal government more power and taking away influence from state and local governments. The American Soybean Association called on senators to, quote, come to the table and finalize a plan to establish a voluntary national framework for the labeling of foods containing GMOs. Brian Bainig, vice president of Bio, expressed support for the bill. And, of course, they're expressing support. This makes sense. Let me go on a little further. These statements are meant to sound empathetic to the consumer. They are actually deceptive propaganda from individuals representing institutions that will directly benefit from the passage of the DARK Act. The Organic Consumers Association compiled a list of witnesses' connections to the biotech industry. The pro-GMO website Grist said it did its best to portray the hearing as balanced and focused on the science behind GMOs. This is funny. As Grist wrote, of course this was the Agriculture Committee, and I'd expect some pro-GMO sentiments from Democrats with big constituencies of farmers. But I was also expecting to see some senators from more liberal states channeling anti-GMO concerns as well. Instead, I heard strong pro-GMO statements, and no senator planted a flag on anti-GMO ground. And again, I want to take a break here to say, I'm not talking anti-GMOs based on, whether or not you think they're going to make you sick. I personally don't want them and don't want to ingest them. And I also have seen the research which disproves these claims that it could save people in Africa or that GMOs are, feeding the world. No, that it's largely a failure to what it was pitched as, at least so far. Maybe the science will get better, but also ultimately people have a choice what they want to ingest, and companies will, if they're smart and they yield to the market, they will know that people want labeling, and they will voluntarily do that. And this is the government stepping in and taking away people's right to do that, and I don't support that. And also, the problem with supporting genetically modified food is just, even if the science, there's nothing wrong with it and it doesn't harm anybody, it's so, in the United States, there's so much corporatism around this industry with companies like Monsanto and Syngenta and Dow and others, that these industries are not surviving on their own. They're working together with the government. They're people go work for these companies and they come work for the government, and back and forth. And that's a major problem. So as long as that's going on, then I can't support that industry either. And that industry is also tied into the larger farming industrial complex, this massive mass scale farming, which is causing all sorts of problems and harmful effects to the environment and to the people, to the treatment of animals, and on and on and on. So in general, there's no moral way to support these industries at this point. So it goes on from here, and I just basically describe this GMO hearing. And yeah, I want to just kind of end here with what I wrote here in this article. Wherever you stand on the issue of GMOs, we should all recognize that each individual deserves to know what they're eating. The DARK Act will only make it more difficult for states and localities to find remedies to work for their specific environments and needs. The bill will also push the U.S. one step closer to full-on corporatocracy. But what are the solutions for fighting this corporatocracy? The Organic Consumer Association offers this message. Today, we call on millions of American consumers to contact their elected officials with this message. If you vote against states' rights, if you vote against truth and transparency in labeling, if you vote against the more than 90% of Americans who want mandatory, not voluntary labeling of GMO foods, we will vote against you. If you are not one for voting, you should get involved with a local community farm, urban farm, farmer's market, or even just start a backyard garden. And, that's one note I want to say there as well, is I'm not necessarily calling for the same thing that the Organic Consumers Association is. While I support the majority of their message and their cause, I'm not calling for mandatory labeling. I want voluntary labeling by companies. But as I've said, the people who are smart are going to do that already, and some companies have been doing that for a while now. They label their food free of genetically modified foods, and they have third-party testing through things like the Non-GMO Project, which is pretty big. And I know there's some people who are speculative of it, but skeptical of it, but I think they do a good job, and overall, there are companies who are choosing to do this without government force, and that's what I support. So I don't support the government coming in and forcing everybody to go through their federal voluntary program. I don't support the government coming in forcing everybody to go through their mandatory program. I support the consumer's right to know, and I think smart businesses will opt to do that and are already doing that. What I don't support as well is a government being so involved in these industries. Now move on to the next story here. The USDA has, just as, and tied in with this, the USDA, who is at this hearing talking about this dark act, they're actually just recently approved a new Monsanto corn. So, like I said, these industries are tied together. As they're having a hearing about GMO labeling, they're approving a new Monsanto corn, and this is something that they want to get into the industry and into your food, and they don't want you to have any idea that it's there, and they want to take away companies' ability to do that on their own. Amidst growing concern about Monsanto's products, the USDA has approved a new genetically modified corn variety from the corporation. Last Friday, the U.S. Department of Agriculture approved a new genetically modified type of corn produced by Monsanto. This comes from the USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, APHIS. Reuters reports that APHIS conducted a review and concluded the product posed no significant threat to agricultural crops, other plants, or the environment. Monsanto's MON 87411 maize is designed to protect plants against corn rootworms, and have a tolerance to the herbicide glyphosate. Glyphosate is not only recognized as the most widely used herbicide in the world, it is a key ingredient to Monsanto's Roundup products. Now, before officially being allowed on the market, the USDA, US FDA and the EPA have to conduct their own reviews. So this has been approved by the USDA. It still has a couple more approvals to go through, and according to Reuters, the EPA's scientific advisory panel has criticized the guidelines as weak. The panel is attempting to understand the potential impact on pollinators, such as a dwindling bee population. Exactly. So hopefully more people will look at this and decide, some real science and if they're going to have some type of regulation, at least hopefully that they'll use it in some way that's going to be helpful to the people rather than bowing to their corporate partners. APHIS also said it was extending the comment period for genetically engineered corn developed by Syngenta Seeds. So there's another one, Syngenta and Monsanto being the two biggest biotech companies. So this is an interesting aspect here, though. The USDA's preliminary findings of Syngenta's petition found that 14 different glyphosate-resistant weed species exist as of 2014. The agency also stated the risk of herbicide-resistant weeds will continue to be an ongoing problem as long as herbicides are used. Think about that. This is a government agency coming out and saying, look, what they're referencing basically is as the growth of genetically modified crops have come along, and as I said earlier, these genetically modified crops are created to be glyphosate resistant, which is what Syngenta and Monsanto are using. So the plants can fight off, glyphosate, and they can be sprayed with heavy pesticides and still survive. Well, Mother Nature, being the beast that she is, eventually all the grass and these weeds around that are being killed by glyphosate, they adapt and they become resistant. They become stronger. So then they have to come up with more pesticides. And this is what I was saying, is the increased use of GMOs increases the use of pesticides, and that causes problems in the soil, problems to the plants, problems to the animals, problems to humans, and also is creating these super weeds, these resistant. So they're saying that the resistant super weeds that are resistant to glyphosate is going to be an ongoing problem as long as they continue to use them. So this is changing nature. Nature is having to adapt because of the effect that mankind is having on it, specifically these Monsanto, Syngenta people. Fighting herbicide resistance is only one of Monsanto's current problems, of course. In March of this year, we reported that the International Agency for Research on Cancer published a report in the Lancet Oncology journal detailing evaluations of organophosphate pesticides and herbicides. This report concluded that there was evidence of carcinogenity in humans for non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And of course, shortly after that, Monsanto's other pesticide duo, it's a duo enlist pesticide herbicide that they're working on with Dow Chemical, it's been found to be possibly carcinogenic. So they've got products that are probably and possibly carcinogenic, and they want you to use them and spray your food with them. Read more about this article. Finishes up with a video from Ben Swan on Monsanto and crony capitalism. But as I just said, that with this labeling bill and the Dark Act, these companies are so tied in with the government, they're going to get whatever they want. And people need to start really, I mean, this is the point where victory gardens is a real thing. Resistance gardens. This is real life. You got to start growing your own food and finding ways to fight this, because they're coming for your food and they're going to poison everything around it if they get their way. So grow your victory garden.